All right, so if you have assignment 4, pass them down to the end here. I do not have a stapler, unfortunately, but I will make sure to try to figure out whose is whose. Maybe if you bend the corner.
Oh, we're struggling.
While I'm collecting these assignments, I did want to let you know, and a few of you have contacted me already, but final exam time, all right? If you have a conflict with your final exam, say you have another class at the same time as this one, that the exam is scheduled in, contact one of your instructors and we will make sure to reschedule it. You also have the right that if you have 3 exams on one day, all right, you can talk to one of your professors of the exams on that day and reschedule it. All right, but you have to let your professors know well ahead of time. All right, don't do it the day before. Try not to do it the week of. In fact, this week would be a great week to make sure everything's organized for your final exams and contact any professors if needed. And so here. I did want to say too that the class schedule, I'm going to go in after class today and reorganize it just a little bit on these last few lectures. All right, so we are running behind. So essentially I'm just going to shift the lectures down and there's no longer going to be a day that says to be determined. All right, there will be a lecture on that day. All right, any questions about anything so far? All right, we have quite a bit to get through today. So we left off on speciation. Right, I hope you had a chance to watch this video because I think it's a funny video to begin with. Right, but it tells us how that biological species concept is a little problematic. And we started to talk about the mechanisms of speciation before we ran out of time. So we're going to finish up this lecture first before transitioning into population dynamics. So I can't remember if we went over this slide or not yet. I see some head shaking no. All right, so speciation. That's just a fancy word of saying we're forming a new species. All right, that can be caused by genetic changes that make it different from the species from which it derived. It could be due to abrupt events that cause reproductive isolation. This might be abrupt changes in chromosome number that make you incompatible with another species. It could be arise as a consequence to adaptation to different ecological niches. All right, and this bottom one here, as a consequence to adaptation to different ecological niches, we see this one more commonly. All right, so if we look at patterns of speciation, we can talk about cladogenesis. All right, so cladogenesis, again, fancy word for saying division of species into 2 or more species. All right, so we're taking an example of this bird here, and we're dividing it into 2 species instead of 1. Right? One of the species will have something slightly different to it, depending on what biological concept we're looking at. We could maybe apply the morphological concept here, and that it looks different. Right? It has a longer tail, slightly different coloration. Right? But we're dividing a species into 2 or more. Now this is going to require gene flow. Right? So there has to be gene flow between populations to be interrupted. Right? I should have started that sentence a little differently there. Gene flow interrupted is what is required. That's going to eliminate reproduction between members of different populations. All right, so if we're no longer having reproduction between different populations, they have a chance to maybe start to rise to become new species on their own. If we have migration between those 2 species, we're constantly introducing new genetic variation, right? And the chances of cladogenesis happening is going to be very slim. Right, so we're interrupting gene flow. Now we have different patterns of cladogenesis that we can look at. One is allopatric speciation. Right, this is the most prevalent method, and this occurs when members of a species become geographically separated. All right, so put a little image to the side of an example of a ground squirrel population here. Maybe these are chipmunks here. But we have some sort of geological event that is separating this population into 2. And in this case, it's the formation of a river. right? Over time, by these slow geological processes, right, these populations can no longer interact with each other, right? And when they no longer interact with each other, they can start to evolve independently to the different environments that they're at, right? So we can, over time, get new species arise because of some geological obstruction, right? Maybe that's a mountain range, or maybe that's a glacier dividing a population, right? It could be a whole variety of things. All right, a good example of this are the porkfish. All right, so the porkfish, they lived in the Caribbean Sea here. We have two different species of porkfish that look very similar because they had a common evolutionary ancestor. All right, so before the Isthmus of Panama, all right, I really struggle over that word, formed, all right, and there was a continuous flow between these two sides of the sea, right? This species was one species. All right, but once that isthmus formed, all right, divided the ocean into two, we separated out our populations, we eliminated gene flow, they evolved into two separate species of porkfish. All right, one thing about allopatric speciation is that we can get a phenomenon called adaptive radiation. All right, so we see this a lot with islands typically. But that occurs when a small population moves to a new location that is geographically separated. So in our example here, we have this bird from Asia, made it all the way to Hawaii in the distant past. Once it got to Hawaii, there was a variety of habitats that were open for it to live in, right? And as a result, this one species, all right, evolved into many different species depending on the habitat and the type of food that was available, right? So that's called adaptive radiation. A single ancestral species evolves into an array of descendants that differ in habitat, can differ in behavior. All right, the other form of cladogenesis is sympatric speciation. So this occurs when members of the species are within the same range. Right? So they're not geographically divided anymore. They can inhabit the same area, but they diverge into two or more different species, even though there's no barrier to interbreeding. All right? So they could interbreed with each other, but there's some sort of barrier inhibiting this happening. All right? So that might be polyploidy. Right? So when we have different ploidy levels in our chromosomes, or adaptations to local environments. So if we look at polyploidy, all right, so if an organism has two or more sets of chromosomes, we say they're polyploid. All right, so remember, haploid is one set, diploid is two set. Polyploid is more than two sets. All right, it could be 3, it could be 5, it could be 10. All right, we typically see this in plants. All right, plants are known to be more tolerant of polyploidy than animals. A lot of times in animals, if you become a polyploid, it's going to lead to some delirious results. All right. It can occur through non-disjunction, right? So we've talked about non-disjunction before. I threw up an image of non-disjunction happening, right? Basically, the chromosomes are not separating out equally, and as a result, we get polyploidy. All right, so this is an example of sympatric cladogenesis. All right, now we can have these interspecies breeding, right? We can also get polyploidy this way. So if we have two species breed with one another, two different species breed with one another, right? They can produce an allodiploid, all right, an organism that has one set of chromosomes from a different species, all right? So in our example here, we have these two different carp. They are two different species. They are breeding with each other to create a hybrid. Now this hybrid just has one chromosome from each fish, all right, from each species. This would be an allodiploid. Now if this carp, this hybrid, goes on to breed with another fish, all right, that has two chromosomes, all right, two sets of chromosomes, we can get an allotetraploid, all right? So it's going through, not reducing its gametes, all right? So we have our original set from our hybrid, all right? Then we have half of the chromosomes from that diploid organism here. And as a result, we get an allotetraploid, all right? I'm not too concerned with you knowing these results, right? But I want to show these just to give you an example of what it means to have speciation with polyploidy. We can also have adaptation to local environments, all right? So populations can occupy different environments that are continuous with each other, but still diverge into different species. So a good example of this is the North American maggot fly. All right, this fly originally fed on native hawthorn trees. We introduced apple trees about 200 years ago. That provided a new environment for these flies and other organisms to start to inhabit. Right? And these apple-feeding populations just happen to develop more rapidly because these apples matured more quickly than the hawthorn fruit. Right? Now, over time, the maggots that fed on the apples versus the hawthorn fruit tended to divide, right? Because the fruit of the apples ripened more quickly, we started to have a temporal separation. Right? So a temporal separation led to speciation because now temporally they don't mate with each other. All right. Today we're seeing populations of pea aphids. They are evolving based on preference for different food sources. All right, so evolution is still occurring. It's something that is happening right now in many, many species. This pea aphid is a good example of that. Eventually, they might evolve into separate species depending on which food they prefer. All right, so just to kind of break up the lecture slides here, I want you to talk with one another and identify those key differences between allopatry and sympatry. Should be pretty straightforward. Yeah.
So for our results, I can't get this to stick up with our figure. So if it's spaced out like this, you want me to put the results all on one.
That's fine. Okay. That's fine.
It's like what's bothering me on that, I couldn't get it to.
Yeah, Word can be kind of finicky in that way.
Yeah.
Yep.
One is the graphic, I think it's separated in sympatry. So like, think of it like this.
All right, it got quiet. So allopatry. What is allopatry? What is allopatric speciation?
There we go.
What is causing species to arise? Yeah, geographical separation. Might be a river has formed, a mountain range has emerged, glaciers have entered into whichever territory they're inhabiting. All right, some sort of geographical separation. All right, what about sympatric speciation? Where do we get different species this way?
They're like in the same area, they just happen to develop differently based on what they're eating.
Yeah, exactly. So there's no geographic difference now, right? But they're still developing into two different species based on what they're eating, maybe based on their genetics, all right? Something is causing them to diverge rather than a geographic consequence. All right, any questions about speciation? All righty, believe that was the last slide. Yes, it was. So let's now move on to population dynamics. And before I officially start talking about it, all right, I asked you to watch that phylogeny video, all right, and I posed this question at the end of the video, right? How would you draw the most parsimonious tree showing the relationships among these four species? All right, did anybody get to make this tree?
I'll be real with you. I sat down and opened my email and I was like, oh yeah, let's go.
All right, so I'm going to say take about 5 minutes right now. Try to come up with a parsimonious tree. And remember, when I'm saying parsimonious tree, I am meaning the fewest evolutionary changes in our tree. If you watch the lecture, you should have a good understanding of this. If you did not, make sure you watch the lecture before the exam for sure. And if I have a volunteer, you can come tree up on the board.
I don't want to be wrong for the third time. So.
I know it's a little intimidating.
My ends are so. They're charging for the bus bus in January. I don't know. I saw it on
That's so
YouTube.
funny.
The comments is loading. So. Oh, I wish my grade first on it. Football players got the deep fried omelets. Is it normal to kiss your sister?
This is a simple diversion. You should be able to eventually get there. But it's not just a matter of, well, that one's there, that one's for next, that one's after that. You have to think about what makes this harmonious, what makes it with this evolutionary change.
Oh, someone just keep getting to imagine the line.
That's just random.
The urge to go to big turkey.
Totally random.
What if you go green? But you can go the middle, the one on the right, the very middle, it's still the same color, just got one line.
What?
It's like,
It's like a hamster.
no.
Oh,
It looks
yeah.
like this. Nice.
You want to go up there and draw it?
But like,
Go up there.
no, I don't want to.
Go up there.
See, do you see this?
I'll go up there and I'll attempt to do the thing if I can just draw a dog.
If you can also draw a dog.
That's not the video that I'm making. I feel like that was on purpose.
No. See, you have like a little shaggy ear. Look at that. Perfect. I really want it. You make me nice and hair, you know, and just go through this together.
You just like food color the eggs.
This is what I see. Yeah, like that making it.
It made it
I
perfect.
see it. Oh, and then.
All right, so let's come together and think about this. All right, so we have our 4 squares that evolved from our ancestor squares. All right, so what among the 4 squares are the most similar? What trait shows up the most often in our 4 squares?
Line.
A
Yellow.
line.
Oh, yellow.
Yellow, yep, we know yellow because
Wait,
yellow
no.
was the ancestor,
Wait,
so
no,
yellow's
line.
evolving. But then we find a line. Which line?
Vertical.
Vertical line, yeah. So I would say that's probably going to be at the base of your tree. All right, that's what most of them share in common. What about next? What might be the next trait that's most common?
Circle and horizontal, I would say.
Circle, horizontal. All right, this is where we get into kind of some trial and error bits. All right, remember we want to find the fewest evolutionary changes. And I actually went through and drew the tree out for you. And there's a couple of different ways that you could do it. All right, this one I think is a little messier, all right, but it still gets the same concept across. I think this one's easier to
There we
read.
go.
Yeah, so you're right, that vertical line, that shows up pretty early, right? Then we get our circle developing, then we get our horizontal line, all right, but this green one is kind of an outlier, right? At some point, it has to lose the circle.
Could we do it with like the green one wait, that doesn't make sense.
I mean, you could, but would it be parsimonious?
I don't know what that means.
Would it have the fewest evolutionary changes?
Oh.
Because if the green branched out from down below here, we'd have to have it evolve the vertical lines, evolve the horizontal line, and become green, right? But then on the other side, we also have to evolve
Wait,
the
no.
vertical line and the
Wait,
horizontal line.
What if he evolves it like from just the vertical? Like, because then it's just.
Well, there'd still be a few more changes in there. All right, I'm going to leave you on this brain teaser that this is how it should be. All right, if you haven't watched that Phylogeny Trua, make sure you watch it because that will be on the exam. All right, but we're going to move into population dynamics here and see how far we get. It is pretty long. For those of you that take notes ahead of time, I did try to simplify things and I deleted a few slides. So you might notice some changes. I don't have any homework for you on Wednesday, but we do have a quiz this Friday just to keep that in mind. All right, so we're talking about ecology in this lecture. So in ecology, we're talking about interactions between organisms, even between abiotic factors in the environment. All right, so we can go from looking at an organism, all right, to looking at how the organisms interact with each other in a population, to looking at a community, right, organisms interacting with each other, and to looking at the ecosystem. Right, this is where we're looking at interactions of organisms with abiotic factors. All right, today we're really going to start by looking at population ecology. All right, so ecology, interaction of organisms with biotic and abiotic environments. You should know what biotic and abiotic mean by now after going through lab last week. And we're starting with population ecology. All right, so again, I know we've defined this multiple times, but a population is a group of individuals of a single species that occupies the same area. Right? They're relying on the same resource, they're influenced by the same environmental factors, and they're likely to interbreed with one another. All right, when we're looking at populations, all right, researchers might be interested in knowing something about them, right? Measuring the population size or measuring the density, right? So we're studying population ecology, which looks at population size and how they might change. Right? And we're going to use the tools of demography. So when we're looking at demography, we're looking at birth rates, death rates, immigration, emigration, age, size of populations. All right, we're going to include all of this when we're trying to analyze our population size. We're also going to look at density. All right, so I threw up this picture of the penguins there. They have a pretty dense population, all right, but it works for them, so that's good. But density is going to differ depending on what organism we're looking at. And depending on if this organism happens to be in an area that humans have to try to manage, right? Knowing something about their population size and density might help us manage their populations. So think about, I know deer hunting is really common in Minnesota, all right? The DNR looks every year at the population of deer and decides how many permits they should allow to go out there, right? That way we're keeping the population size in check, but we're not diminishing the population size below where it needs to be healthy. All right, so if we're looking at population density, we have to be able to measure it, right? And we can measure this a couple different ways. One of them is just a sample visual count. Right? This is really common with plants or organisms that don't move. All right. So with the plants, you might put down a quadrant and try to measure every species and how many of each species is in each quadrant to get an idea of what your population looks like. With organisms that do move, right, we might want to use some capture methods. Right? It might be a pitfall trap that we use to capture small organisms, often insects. This mist net, which birds will fly into and get tangled up, but does not harm them. And then the live mammal trap, right? Capturing, maybe it's a bear, maybe it's a skunk, whatever organism you're trying to look at. Right, now there are a few problems associated with capture methods in that animals might get used to them. They might learn to avoid the traps, or they might learn to seek them out because they contain food. All right, so there are some downsides, but we weigh the positives and negatives to try to figure out the best method for your population that you're looking at. I want to just highlight a couple of ways that we might do this. All right, so for plants, I mentioned the quadrant. All right, that's good for a small plant species. But if we try to put this 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter square over top of a 60-foot tall tree, all right, that's not going to go very well. It's going to be very hard to do, probably impossible. So instead we use a line transect, where we basically measure out a distance from point to point in a straight line and take a measurement of all the plants that happen to intersect that line within 100 meters. Right? So this is really good for trees that we can't put a quadrant over. Marked and recapture method. All right, you see this goat with the tag on it there. Right? We're capturing organisms, we are tagging organisms, and we are releasing them again. That way, if they're ever recaptured, we have some information on that specific organism. Right? So maybe it's a migrating bird, we tagged it before it migrated, caught it after it migrated. We could see how far it went. All right? So mark and capture gives us some pretty cool data. But when we want to talk about population size, this is where we have to look at the demography. All right? Talking about birth rates and death rates. All right? So this is where we're looking at life tables. So a life table is a data on the number of individuals alive in a particular age class. Right? Now, males are not usually included. All right? So females are normally the only ones included because they're the ones that give rise directly to the offspring. All right? Now, typically, males and females, if you were to look at a life table, they'd probably be pretty similar between males and females, but we're only going to use females. Now, with the North American beaver, I will show you an example of a life table here, that these Canadian trappers basically provided mandibles to the scientists. The scientists took the teeth out of the mandible, and from that, they could look at the age classification. All right, and they came up with a life table. All right, so the life table has a lot of information on it. Right? I don't expect you to know everything about it, right? But I want you to know what you can get out of it. So on this column here, we have the age. Right? This is 1 year increments. We look at the number alive at the start of the year. Right? So basically the number that was born. All right? Then we look at the number that die. All right? Then we go back and we look at the number that's still alive at age 1 through 2. All right? And look at how many died in that age class. So on and so forth. From this, we can look at age-specific survivorship rate. All right? So the number in that age class divided by the number of offspring for that generation. All right? We can also look at age-specific fertility. All right? And finally, we can look at our net reproductive rate. All right? I'm going to come back to that because I'm going to have you do a worksheet on that. But before we do the worksheet, I want to look at survivorship curves. All right, so this life table can give us information on how individuals survive throughout their lifetime. Right, now a survivorship curve, right, we're looking at the lifespan and the number of survivors. And there's different curves that can start to emerge. All right, so type 1, we have few juveniles that are born typically, and they live to an adult age before they start to die. So individuals die later in life. Humans are a good example of that. Type 2, such as these lizards and also the beavers we were just looking at, they have a fairly uniform death. Right? It doesn't matter which age they are, they die at the same rate. And then type 3, juveniles, or the young, do not survive very well. All right? So a lot of young will die off at first before having this larger lifespan. All right? So typically for type 3, these individuals are going to have huge amounts of offspring, knowing that most of them will die off before they reach maturity. All right, so looking at this curve, what type of survivorship curve is represented here? Type 1, yeah. So we have individuals that survive when they're young, right, and then they typically die when they get old. So if an individual has a lot of offspring, but many do not survive, what type of survivorship curve might that be? Type 3, yes, exactly. Yep, going back to that graph right there. All right. So this is where we have some math again, all right? And I figured instead of throwing numbers at you, I'm going to have you do a worksheet to learn this a little bit easier. All right? It's not a long worksheet. It's not a hard worksheet, all right? But I'm going to pass it around. I'll give you some time to do it. Looks like we only have about 10 minutes left of class. If it takes all 10 minutes, that is okay. If it doesn't, we'll come back together. It's harder in that there's a lot more equations. Easier in that I don't understand what you know the yeah, that's basically what this is. So yes, that was a good question. This type of math here, I'm probably not going to ask you to do on an exam, and if I do, I will give you everything you would possibly need to do it. Don't expect you to memorize these equations, right? Unlike Hardy Weinberg, those I expect you to memorize and be able to apply. Sounds good. Which side? I'm not going to leave it on that one though, because that tells you the answer. I suppose you could just go put back in your side.
Okay.
Yeah.
My head is
I'll come to you here. Question.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I'm just going to make up the equations and we're finding R and zero.
Every single thing. If we look at LX and X, add all that. I got it.
Oh, let's calculate out. Correct, I got it.
That just means add it all together. That means the sum of all of these. Yes. The sum of all of LX, MX, all. So for question one, we're looking at the net reproductive rate. Right? The equation is R0 equals the sum of LX and X. If we look at our table, there is a column that is LX, MX, and we're taking the sum of that column. We have to add up all those numbers. Fancy way of saying add it all together. E is the sum. And it just means add it all together. Sum all of that together.
What are you adding? No. Add this over here.
Add all the numbers and add it all together.
Look at what you're calculating. The sum of this. Add it all together.
Well, I said smart.
Yeah, so the numbers are not Don't overthink it.
Yeah, they did it for us. They didn't take all this together. Okay, so we could
Slide under my door. How would you feel about this? How would you feel about this? What is
Now this I don't. So if R zero is 1.1, don't we just have to subtract?
We're looking at the second page.
1.1 minus 938, so the R2, the LX MX for the next generation would be 0.162. What's T plus one?
Oh, I do?
Yeah.
What would T be?
So the T is just telling you that at some point in time. It's just so n subscript T plus 1 means it's time
So it
now.
would be 1,000
Plus 1
times
year.
1.1.
Right? So you don't actually have to calculate that.
1,000 times 1.1 is what I'm hearing.
That is exactly right. Yes. We're just we're following the worksheet here. Does it make sense? Alright.
You keep giving me all these different equations.
How do I understand this? I don't really get how I understand it, but I do. Yeah, but I don't know what I'm doing here.
So for this worksheet, I'm just trying to have you follow these equations. Just kind of understand where we're ending up at. I don't expect you to memorize these. Right, but we have a question, the last one? Yeah.
Oh, I was following this one.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, I made a mistake on that one.
Oh, okay.
So the very last question, it says, let's look at a different population. Also assume that population of birds started with 100 birds. I forgot to write that on there.
And 1.1
I can repeat that again when you get to it.
to the 7.
Well, it's good.
I have a question.
Yes.
Wait, what do you so, I don't know, I just got, this is right here, like, when I was left off my bill, like,
Yes.
I can all that. I just,
Do we have questions?
yeah, is this correct? My last one?
Last one.
Do you want to work right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly correct.
Oh my, why am I keep falling down?
Okay, I think I got
Alright,
it.
so it looks like this will take the rest of the time period, which is only 2 minutes left. I have the answers going to be posted on Moodle at 1:30.
You check it
Alright,
out.
so if you want to look at the answers on your own,